All right, we are live on Learn Liberty today. We're going to talk about great things. First of all, thank you very much for joining us, Eric.
Yes.
Let me introduce you first because he has a lot of degrees. So he holds a Ph.D. in American history from University of Wisconsin at Madison, and he has taught history, political science, and economics at Duke, Georgetown, and also currently assistant director at Clemson University, Clemson Institute for Study of Capitalism. We talked a little bit about it, but I hope he will give us more information about that.
Sure.
And today we're going to talk about free speech without compromise. So this is a continuation of our series on Learn Liberty that we had 3 of them last year. Well, this year, but feels like another year, with Craig Biddle. And today we're continuing the series. This is the 4th of them, and we're going to talk about free speech. Thank you very much for joining us, Eric.
Yeah, it's great to be here. It's great to be with the audience.
Perfect. So you tell us about yourself. I did a bit of a
Sure. Yeah, a little bit of a bio. I mean, so my primary background is actually in intellectual history. I study the history of ideas, and in specific, I have a deep interest in the history of legal political ideas, and especially the foundations of a free society. And as you mentioned, I'm here at the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, which is a very unique thing. It's America's really only university college-based think tank, as it were, that's dedicated to studying and defending the moral foundations of a free society and of capitalism. So we have programs not only for lectures and series, but we also teach, and we have a scholarship program that students who come to Clemson can receive a 4-year scholarship to take a series of classes, one class per semester that they're here, to read the great books and the important documents of the American founding and the great documents in the tradition of liberty. So it's a really exciting place to be.
Amazing.
Yeah, and if people would like to find out more, I do encourage them to visit. The easiest way to find it is just clemson.edu/capitalism. And Clemson, for those of your audience who don't know, is CLEMSON. So yeah, you can find out all kinds of stuff about us. You can find our Exploring Capitalism Substack. You can find some of the videos of past lectures that we've done with some really great speakers and great thinkers on a whole variety of topics around the free society.
Perfect. Go check out the website, go check out the capitalism studies, go out there. And also, we've been very busy today talking all the other issues that's happening around the world, especially what's happening in Ukraine. SFL has condemned whatever is happening in Ukraine, especially Russia's attack. And we have a lot of people from SFL, friends of SFL in Ukraine, and also around the countries around Ukraine. Everybody's trying to help, trying to pull whatever they can. Our alumni, we're very thankful for them as well. Would you like to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, it's a great. I mean, to me, it's a great tragedy. What's happening. I hope that the world community, and especially the liberty community, can come together in supporting Ukraine, because I know people there. I know people who have immigrated from there. It is in many ways a beacon for the values of the West in that part of the world, and it would be a great tragedy to see that come under a kind of totalitarian rule that it looks like Putin and Russia want to impose there. So I really think it's an important issue in our time for people who care about the world cause of liberty.
I agree, and I think what we do here right now gets even more and more important when we see these kind of events in the world. It seems very unlikely, very impossible, a couple weeks away from now, but free speech is always as important, and especially today. So I think it's a timely topic we're going to try to tackle here in 1 hour as much as we can. So the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah. So it is. I mean, I reflected on that in thinking about the way events were building up to what we are witnessing in the world, but also in many ways it is, as you said, it's a persistent theme of the struggle for freedom, the struggle for a free society, because I think the philosopher Ayn Rand once observed, if we don't have the ability to advocate for liberty, that is when we know that that things have gotten really bad. And it is one of the areas that is most in need of protection. It is misunderstood, it is confused, and it often receives, I would say, a half-hearted defense. For those around the world, not just in countries that have more robust traditions for freedom of speech, like the United States or in Great Britain and other parts of Europe, but anywhere in the world, the freedom to discuss and advocate and speak out on political and social and cultural topics, religious topics, whatever happens to be, is absolutely vital to freedom. And I want to spend some time today talking about what that more robust and complete view of free speech is. I think that's something that is missing often from the debate. I want to just spend a few minutes at the very beginning reviewing some of the ideas that I think Craig discussed and some of the background, because I think it'll be important to frame our discussion of freedom of speech around just a few points that I want to make about the nature of a free government, the nature of a free society. And the first and most obvious of these is that the fundamental purpose of government is to create a society that protects and enforces individual rights. If for those of you that were able to watch Craig's lectures, or that if you want to go back and see them, what Craig articulates is the important connection between moral action, individual moral action, the freedom to choose and to direct one's life with one's own reason in a political state, in a social state, requires the abolition of force from human relationships. The nature of government is that it is an entity designed, or ideally designed and limited to the functions of protecting individual rights, which means banishing force from human relationships. Individuals to have their rights protected, and I think Craig did a great job of explaining all of the intricacies of the justification for rights. They ultimately rest in human nature. They rest in the nature of a reasoning creature that has to choose and has to direct his or her own life according to one's own knowledge and one's own moral standards. And in society, the thing that is most important to that, so that we can benefit from all of the extraordinary contributions that a social system can create, the economic productivity, the incredible cultural productions, the kinds of relationships that we have, all of the aspects of human flourishing ultimately derive from our ability to engage in trade and mutually beneficial relationships, whether those relationships be personal or economic or social or whatnot. The entity of government then should be directed at ensuring the protection of those rights. And of course, the most fundamental of these being the right to life, the right of each individual to direct his or her own life according to his or her own standards, compatible with the rights of others in that society. And the derivative rights, as they are, the right to property, the right to liberty, and ultimately, as an aspect of our liberty, the right to free speech, come from that same moral basis. It is the reason that society protects those is to protect the individual as a moral actor in the world. Now, as I said, the justification for freedom of speech and the right to free expression in the American context, and really more broadly in the world context, has had what I would call a tenuous basis. One of the problems that we experience today in the world is that the understanding of why we have free speech and why it is so important in a free society is often compromised by misunderstandings or misjustifications for what free speech actually means and what its restriction might mean, what those things look like. What does it mean to say that there is freedom of speech? What is censorship, for example? These questions are vital today because if we don't understand these and if we don't properly define these, we're at risk of doing two things that fundamentally compromise free speech. One of those things is that we fail to fully recognize when individuals have a freedom to speak, that we consent to or assent to or even simply passively accept the instances when people's freedom of speech is restricted when it shouldn't be. Another major problem today is that people with an incorrect notion of those concepts or an incorrect understanding of free speech not only allow limitations of speech that should not happen, but they also allow things to be protected as if they were free speech, or things to be protected under the justification for free speech that actually harm other rights that aren't instances of free speech. For example, when an individual might say, well, if my free speech is being limited, the government should come in and stop this action that someone is taking, when in fact that isn't a violation of free speech. So we have two potential problems. One, an underprotection of speech, and two, an overprotection of what is not actually speech. And so we need to get very, very clear on the nature of what is free speech. Before we get into the American tradition and broadly more the Anglo-American tradition, I want to mention and to highlight a few of the ways that free speech has been understood. In the American context, obviously, the First Amendment to the Constitution is the primary locus of our attention when we consider free speech. But ironically, it wasn't until the 20th century that the Supreme Court of the United States even started adjudicating free speech cases. And the reason for that is dual. On the one hand, because the First Amendment clearly states Congress shall make no law, it was seen as being limited only to federal cases, only to actions where the federal government might impose restrictions upon the speech of its citizens. And so it was only during World War I, when the Wilson administration oversaw the passage of a Sedition Act, a prohibition against anti-government speech, that many of these cases first started arising. And it was also only after the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868 when the Supreme Court and when legal thinkers in the United States started to understand that the 14th Amendment, in its due process, its equal protection, and its privileges and immunities clause, actually applied the Bill of Rights to state action as well, that it was all the way down in the American political system that freedom of speech needed to be protected. But they also inherited older ideas. In order to understand free speech, many American thinkers, both in the courts and outside of the courts, in politics, in philosophy, and other areas, relied upon an older set of traditions that we'll get to in just a minute. But when we ask the question, why do we need freedom of speech? One of the first answers, and indeed probably the most popular answer that is given, is because it is what is essential to a free political system. That the freedom of speech is how we have to, it's the, in a sense, it's the chip that we need to spend in order to have a political process that keeps our representatives informed of what the citizens want, that allows us to express dissent, that allows us to advocate for candidates who will improve our situation. In effect, it's an idea that the political process, that what representative government is tied intimately to the ability of individuals to speak about subjects in the public, in public affairs. One of the great thinkers, although he was indeed in some ways flawed, but one of the great expressions of this idea was the First Amendment scholar Alexander Meiklejohn, who in the middle of the 20th century argued that, quote, the First Amendment was not adopted, for example, to protect vehicles of advertising or entertainment. Although these are legitimate activities, they're similar to stockbroking or circuses. Instead, he said, what is essential is not that everyone shall speak, but that everything worth saying shall be said. Elected officials, he noted, quote, are authorized to limit the freedom of men as they go about the management of their private, their non-political affairs. The same men, as they endeavor to meet public responsibilities of citizenship in a free society, are in a vital sense beyond the reach of the legislature, end quote. So what Meiklejohn was saying is that the things that we protect as our freedoms, the Bill of Rights, the things that we say government cannot touch, ought to be the things specifically dealing with public affairs. And there has been, through the courts and through many of the Supreme Court decisions, a broad justification that the arguments that we have about political life have to be protected. And this even goes all the way back to the origins of free speech in the Anglo-American context, when freedom of speech was first guaranteed not to the public, but to members of parliament, so that they could have free discussion, the so-called parliamentary privilege, that they would be immune from suits at law for speaking in ways that were either libelous or slanderous or that might be offensive to the king, so that Parliament, the lawmaking body of England, could have free discussion of public affairs. And then gradually, as the Americans came to adopt that, that was seen as a justification for why we had freedom of speech. But it's very easy, if we stop to think about this, that there's a massive, massive limitation that goes along with this. If the freedom to speak and if our right to free speech is contingent upon it being about public affairs, it's very easy to see that the government would then be able to censor and would be able to restrict our speech that it deems outside of public bounds, that our private speech, the speech that we engage in any other form besides political speech, could be limited. So that justification is incredibly robust. Meiklejohn and others in the middle part of the 20th century had a robust defense of unlimited political speech. And indeed, the progressive tradition starting in the 20th century defended the idea that political topics should be completely left open, that as long as there was not material danger to the public from the speech, that it should be open season. Unfortunately, that has that broad limitation. So another of the justifications and another of the arguments about why we should have freedom of speech actually comes, again, from the Anglo-American tradition. It has its deepest roots in John Milton and even in William Blackstone. And this is the argument that freedom of speech is what allows us to get at truth, that the process of contending different ideas in the public is ultimately the way that we arrive at what we deem to be true. Now, the argument here, of course, is that false ideas and true ideas compete in a kind of marketplace of ideas, that they both contend for public favor, and that ultimately one or the other side will arrive at the top, that this will be what society deems to be true. So, for example, John Milton in the 17th century, in his famous piece, the Areopagitica, it's hard to say, it's a Latinate word, he basically argued that truth is partial and scattered, that no one has any unified claim to the truth, but that if it gives a fair fight, truth will always win out, that it emerges from clashing opinions, and that if you suppress the truth, all that does is it makes it more resolute in its attempt to win out. So there's an argument that then the truth as a value should be why we guide free speech. Now, this again seems very robust as a defense of free speech. And it again feels very familiar to many of us who have read, for example, the 19th century English writer, John Stuart Mill, who had a same conception that allowing robust discussion of even topics that were seen as blasphemous or obscene would be a way to get at the fundamental truth of the issue. Again, though, this is a justification that constrains the way that that constrains the freedom of individuals, because the government can obviously declare, as is so apparent today, that perhaps we ought to get rid of misinformation or disinformation, or even in the early 19th century, what they would call false opinion, as though one's opinion about matters in society could be deemed true or false. Others today, Brian Leiter, a prominent law professor, argues that low-value speech about what he calls frivolous matters, are so small as a contribution to the pursuit of truth that they can be suppressed. So again, if the truth emerging from discussion is our standard, then we're leaving ourselves open and we're leaving the government open to be able to suppress things that are declared officially to be not a progress toward truth, that they have low truth value, as it were. As Justice Frankfurter once said, of a particular speech that he wished to suppress, that there's such a low likelihood that this is a step to truth that it's worth suppressing, that it's not a part of this public discussion. And then the final of these ways, I think, the mistaken ways of understanding the reason why we have freedom of speech, I want to quote a little bit more extensively. This is from a prominent law professor who was a scholar of the First Amendment in the 20th century. And this is an argument that the freedom of speech is primarily about facilitating self-fulfillment, facilitating a kind of personal development in all citizens. He notes that both private and public speech, quote, every person in the development of their own personality has the right to form their own beliefs and opinions. It also follows that they have the right to express those beliefs and opinions. Otherwise, they are of little account. Expression, he says, is an integral part of the development of ideas and mental exploration of the affirmation of self. The power to realize their potentiality as a human being begins at that point. End quote. Now, this again, I think is getting a little bit closer to the truth. It's getting a little bit closer to the full justification, but it comes under attack. Even though we might say that it's what facilitates the development of each individual as an individual, there's a problem with saying that that's the justification for freedom of speech. Because again, we can limit it by saying, well, there are certain things, obscenity or violent video games or other things that don't really contribute to the value of an individual, or they contribute in ways that are socially unacceptable and therefore ought to be restricted. So again, we have to be very careful to think, what is the justification for freedom of speech? How do we defend it on its broadest, most philosophically stable grounds in order that we can advance this? Now, the answer to the question of how all of these justifications, excuse me, how all of these justifications work out in practice is actually pretty interesting. In the United States, as I mentioned, up through the early part of the 20th century, there were relatively few, only a handful of major cases dealing with the freedom of speech. But very quickly in the 20th century, particularly out of this trio of cases that emerged in the early 1919 court term regarding the Sedition Act, the court started having to decide numerous cases in the traditional areas that had been considered to be outside of the realm of free speech. So to step back for a second, as this tradition was developing in England, in the British tradition about the freedom of speech, there was seen to be necessary exceptions. That this wasn't truly a right. A right would mean that it would admit of no exceptions. If you have a right to do something, there aren't exceptions to doing that. But in the British tradition, there was a notion that the freedom of expression was a value that had to be balanced against other values. And in that balancing act, those social values could overrule certain types of speech. And in particular, there were these categories. Blasphemy, so any kind of speaking against the church or against established moral codes. Obscenity, anything that was seen as being sexually outside the bounds of proper discussion. Sedition, so any kind of anti-government speech. And then, of course, defamation, so libel and slander, speech against someone that harmed their reputation. America followed along that line. Largely speaking, they considered, at least most American legal thinkers considered, that there were, broadly speaking, exceptions to the First Amendment. But in the late 19th century, there were scholars that started to suggest that there was a broader justification for freedom of speech. And one of these scholars, just on the eve of when these cases started to come up, articulated what I think is a very clean idea of the goal of free speech. And it's probably no mistake that many of the thinkers in this tradition that appeared for just a moment in the late 19th century were associated with what is often called laissez-faire jurisprudence. They were a set of thinkers who, in the late 19th century, were attempting to devise and understand the law and its development as a way of protecting freedom, protecting liberty as a base value in American society. And so thinkers like Thomas Cooley and John Burgess began to articulate largely their reputation is their articulation of defense of economic rights, the right to property, the right to contract, but they also had justifications for the right to freedom of speech. Cooley noted in his treatise that the one aspect of liberty, that liberty had many facets, that how you exercise your liberty can be in diverse and in many ways. He said, one of these is to be free in the enjoyment of your faculties. Citizens must be left at liberty to speak with the freedom which the magnitude of the supposed wrongs appears in their minds to demand. Though some persons may exceed all proper bounds of moderation, the consolation must be that the evil likely to spring from violent discussion will be less, and its correction by public sentiment more speedy than if the terrors of the law were brought to bear to prevent the discussion. End quote. So he effectively says you need to protect speech even when you think it's dangerous, even when you disagree with it, because it's the process of speech that is a protection for our liberty, for our sense of who we are as a rights-bearing citizen. Now, the early cases that came in the United States upheld the sedition prosecutions. So famously, in the Schenck case in 1919, Justice Holmes said that the imminence of the danger, that there was a clear and present danger, famously in his decision, that could be suppressed because Schenck had published a document criticizing the draft, criticizing the ability of the government to compel individuals to serve in the military and risk death for World War I. And it wasn't as if he was standing in a draft office pushing people out or, trying to interfere with the actual military. He simply sent out pamphlets advocating that the draft was not unlike involuntary servitude, which had been prohibited by the 13th Amendment. But he was convicted, and his conviction was upheld by the court because it claimed that sedition was outside of the bounds of protected speech. Over the course of the 20th century, the court started to limit that. They started to see a more direct standard rather than just the bad tendency of speech. The court started to restrain that. And this starts to form one of the interesting patterns about free speech. At the same time that the justification for free speech, the William Chafees and the Alexander Meiklejohns and the others that are articulating this view that speech needs to be limited for political or for truth-seeking value, the protection in the courts was actually growing. One of the great ironies about free speech is that in a technological situation that we exist in now, there are actually more opportunities for free speech, and there's more ability to speak and to gain an audience than there has been at any time in human history. The problem, though, is that freedom that protects our ability to reach those audiences, to use these wonderful technologies in order to get to those audiences, has a shaky philosophic basis. They are fragile in a sense. The justifications don't have a solid foundation. And so even though, things like streaming technology and cell phones and all the wonders of the internet facilitate a lot of speech, it's become less and less theoretically safe. And so what we need to do while we still have the power is to use those means to advocate for more and more of the fundamental justification of free speech. So as the court developed, a number of different cases would start to clarify these areas. In the United States, there was a whole series of cases from the 1950s until the late 1960s and into the 70s clarifying what obscenity was. Famously, a hard to define term, as Justice Potter Stewart said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. It's the slippery term that the court was constantly trying to get its head around. But ultimately, again, the court says it's something that has that obscenity is outside the First Amendment. As long as a material or a work or a movie or whatever it is has serious literary, artistic, political, or social value, it's protected. The so-called SLAPS test coming out of the Miller case. But that ultimately leaves the judgment about what is valuable to the court, to the community. As the court in Berger validated, local community standards would be the determinant of whether or not a material was obscene. So ask your neighbors whether you can speak about a particular topic. Ask your neighbors whether your political speech is incitement or not. The court also recognized various exceptions throughout the years, one for the so-called fighting words doctrine, where words that would provoke another person to enough anger that they might want to punch you in the face could be prohibited. They could be prohibited because it put the peace of the public at danger. Not literal incitement, mind you, not literally telling a roused up mob to go attack a person that's immediately there, but simply speaking insults, speaking words that might cause an average person to rouse to anger could be prohibited by the government. And so various individuals, in the case of Chablinsky, a Jehovah's Witness who was trying to proselytize his religion, was being attacked by a crowd. And when the police started escorting him away, he called them racketeers and fascists, and he was then arrested. Not because he was provoking a crowd, not because of anything else, but because he had called a public official a name that he didn't like. And that justification now stands in line in these exceptions to the First Amendment. So the American context has developed in a way with various exceptions, various rules, various categories in accepting government control of speech, even though at the same time, citizens, average citizens without newspapers who buy ink by the barrel, and citizens who merely have technology that we all have in our pocket, can now speak in ways that reach audiences well beyond our immediate neighborhoods. So even though the court has been giving more and more power to government in various ways to restrict speech, commercial speech, speech in sensitive areas, speech that might be considered incitement, all of these things, it's actually more speech is available to us. But what we need to do is we need to focus on what is the proper justification. Because if we take the justifications that exist now, if we take those early 20th and mid 20th century justifications, we're ultimately going to lose this battle. We need merely turn to the early progressives, for example, Herbert Crawley or John Dewey, who endorsed the idea of free speech, but always in the context of when it would serve society, when it would serve the collective. Instead, we need to focus on the individual. So rather than Dewey saying, as he did in politics, that the individual must yield to the general welfare, that the content of an individual's beliefs and intentions, he wrote, is subject matter provided by association, not ready-made inherent powers. Or Herbert Crawley, who said, of all the perverted conceptions of democracy, one of the most perverted and dangerous is which identifies with a system of individual rights. These are the people we currently justify or currently borrow from the justification for free speech. These are no friends of liberty. We need a broader and more robust justification for speech. So to get to that, to actually get to where we need to go, I want to pause for a moment and examine these two concepts, freedom and censorship, because I think these ultimately are what the debate is about today. If you read about what First Amendment debates are, whether it's about debates online and Twitter and Facebook and other social media, whether it's about people being banned or shadow banned or censored, etc., all of this has become incredibly confused. And I think that the confusion arises because it's not understood in the context fundamentally of individual rights. So let's start with the concept of freedom. Freedom is often misunderstood and misconstrued as being complete, uninhibited, unlimited action. Freedom, though, properly speaking, is a moral political concept. Freedom means that the authority to direct one's choices and actions rests with oneself. It does not mean that one is unlimited in one's ability to act. I think the best analogy here is the same as if we take a different right and apply it to speech. So consider, for example, the right to property. A property right means that you have the right to acquire, use, dispose, and transfer your property. That means that you have the ability to earn it, to use it for your own purposes, to extinguish it by destroying it or trading it and exchanging it for other value, that you have, in a sense, made it a part of yourself. You control it. But that right to property has never included, for example, the right to use your bat to hit someone else on the head. That's an instance of the initiation of force. And we properly recognize that that is not a legitimate use of property, that your right to use your property does not include the right to harm others, to impose upon them through forcible means. In the context of speech, it's the same. The freedom of speech does not mean all speech. There is speech, in fact, that can cause damage, or there's speech that is, in fact, properly limited by contractual or situational contexts. That means that your freedom to speak does not mean that you have unlimited ability to say anything at any time to anyone for any reason. It simply means that your right to decide when and how and about what to speak is properly yours, not that of the government's. It's not an unlimited ability to do anything you want. Freedom is a political concept, not a metaphysical concept. It's not metaphysically like, I have the freedom to do whatever I want, so I could just jump out this window and start flying. Well, no, I'm not able to fly. I'm not a creature that has that ability. So there's a difference between thinking about something as an ability, what am I able to do, and what am I free to do? So a great example that I borrow from Tara Smith, I am not able to speak French. It's just a fact about who I am. I don't know the language. I can barely get the pronunciation correct when I try, and I haven't ever really studied it. But because I don't have the ability to speak, to speak French, doesn't change anything about my freedom to speak French. There's no law prohibiting me, as there are in some countries, from speaking a language of my choice. There's no law telling me that the books that will teach me how to speak French, or the instructors who will communicate with me how to speak French, are prohibited by government edict from doing so. My freedom is complete. I just haven't chosen or have engaged in the ability to learn how to speak French. So my ability and my freedom are different things. That's often confused in the topic of freedom of speech. My ability to broaden...
a different way of saying, how can you do it, right? So you can speak French, but you can't really speak French.
Yeah, I mean, my ability to get a column in the New York Times is limited. I don't currently have the ability to publish an article in the New York Times. I can try, but my freedom to do so isn't limited. The government hasn't said the New York Times shall not publish Eric Daniels on pain of being, withdrawn from publication. There's no prior permission that the New York Times has. They make their own editorial decisions, but my freedom to do so hasn't been limited, whether they choose to publish me or not. And the same thing goes with censorship. Censorship is a word that's often deployed to mean something not much more than the frustration of a person to speak when they want to speak. But censorship properly means state action. It means that the power of the government, the power of retaliatory force, the police, the jails, the courts, that is mustered against an individual to either obstruct their ability to speak or to punish them after they have spoken. It is not, for example, when the New York Times doesn't agree to publish my article, or when a social media site says that they no longer want me to publish on their site. The idea that censorship is simply the removal of one's ability to speak, that has not been done by government, but that's simply been done by others, is in a way extending censorship to when I walk away from the guy who is haranguing, the public on the street corner about all of his crazy ideas about politics, and I say I choose not to listen to that. That's not censorship. Censorship is state action. Censorship is when you can be compelled against your will from speaking or from being free to have that speech in the post hoc situation if they punish you afterwards. So both of these things are often confused. Censorship is also often confused with that censorship and something being a bad idea. So for example, a lot of people talk about cancel culture today. A lot of people talk about the way that the culture is moving to, as they often say, censor certain views, to remove certain views from public discussion. Now, when that happens as a function of entirely private action, people stop visiting a website, people stop listening to a podcast, people even go to a private company and say, we're no longer going to do business with you unless you stop, platforming this speaker. All of those things are private actions. The company is free to say no. For example, Spotify said no on threat of removal of certain artists' music if they didn't get rid of their contract with Joe Rogan. They said no, we're going to allow it. They may have compromised about different warning labels, et cetera, but they said basically we don't give into that pressure. Others, though, the New York Times, other publications have given into that pressure. They have canceled contracts. They have fired people. They have ended relationships. But what's different about that is that is a cultural phenomenon. Even though many of those instances of people being canceled or shunned, or they lost all their friends, no one wants to listen to them anymore, people call them mean names, etc., that is a bad thing for the culture, right? It is for a culture to adopt a kind of prudishness and social opprobrium and unwillingness to hear difficult ideas is undoubtedly a very, very bad thing. And in fact, we want to cultivate not just a proper justification for the legal basis of free speech, we also want to cultivate a proper cultural appreciation for free speech. I once used to joke with colleagues that if I ever decided to write a book about free speech, I would have to title it something like, and excuse me for it's something like, Nazis, perverts, and bomb threats, defending the undefendable. Because, bomb threats, probably not. That actually would be outside of proper grounds of free speech since it's an invocation of force. But the idea being that if you can't accept the expression of ideas even when they are morally repugnant to you, and you can't defend the right of another individual to engage in that speech, then you're not really a principled advocate of freedom of speech. You have to accept that there is going to be a robust discussion of every issue on the table, and that has to be protected. You don't have to listen to it. You don't have to publish it. You don't have to even listen. You don't even have to know that it's out there, but you have to respect the principle that says that everyone's views should be protected. That cultural censorship is not the same as government censorship. Just because we don't want to hear someone, for example, talk about their weird ideas about aliens, and we all just don't listen to such a person, we don't buy their magazines or visit their websites, doesn't mean that they've been censored. When the government prohibits them, it does. So I want to turn now toward the end so that we have some time for questions to talk a little bit about what is this full justification for the freedom of speech that I've been referencing. What is the proper philosophic understanding? And to do so, I want to turn back to a little bit what I alluded to at the beginning about the nature of individual rights. The freedom of speech and the reason why it needs to be protected as an individual right is because it is the right to express the products of one's rational process. That as a human being, one of the essential observable facts about humanity is that we are rational creatures and that we survive by our rationality. We must engage in a process of thought. We are not like other creatures. We do not have the ability, like horses or giraffes, to start walking minutes after we are born. We don't have the ability to be productive and to cultivate our own productivity for years after we're born. Humans are very unique. We don't have claws. We don't run fast. We don't have fur. We don't have survival. We don't have teeth that can tear into meat. We don't have these abilities. We have a survival mechanism that is all inside our heads. It's reason. It's our ability to apply our knowledge to the world, to solve the questions of survival, to produce shelter and food and all of the wondrous things that human beings can transform the world to serve their needs. But the means of doing so, the only way to get there is through the exercise of our reason, through the exercise of our faculty of thought. But there's a crucial thing that Ayn Rand and others, she's not the only one, have identified. There's one way you can stop thought. There's one very crucial way you can stop thought, and that is force. You can interrupt the connection between someone's ideas about how to catch a fish, how to gather a coconut, how to build a house, how to do anything in the world, from everything from auto mechanics to political theory. All of those things require thought unimpeded by force. As Ayn Rand once observed, thought and force are opposites. The mind ends where the mind ends where a gun begins. Right? The idea is that when I can compel your behavior, I have interrupted your ability to think freely. Because now, if you think differently, you're not able to translate that into action. So, the basis of free speech, the means by which individuals can fully exercise this liberty, is through the ability to express the thoughts, the products of their mind. In the same way that we need to be free to use the products of our physical labor and our mental labor, we need to be able to use the products of our thought. The core meaning of the right to liberty is the right to guide one's choices and actions according to one's own judgments, including your right to think for yourself. And speech is the means by which individuals can communicate the product of their thoughts. It's the implementation of essentially the freedom of thought. It's not enough to say that we need to protect the freedom of conscience, the freedom of thought. We need to protect the means of translating that into action. It wouldn't be enough to say, oh, you've got a right to your property, but you can't do anything with it. Sure, you own that land, but you can't grow crops on it. You can't, shepherd animals on it, and you can't build on it. But it's your land. You don't really have a right if you just have a piece of land that you have a title to. You need to be able to use it. You need to be able to translate it into action. And the same thing goes with your mind, with your brain. So the guarantee of a freedom of speech is the guarantee that we can use our rational faculties in a way according to our own judgment. And the reason it's so important is not just politics. It's not just the development of personality. It's not just the search for truth. It's because every human pursuit, as I said, no matter what kind of pursuit you can think of, all human knowledge ultimately requires the ability to think freely and communicate freely. Imagine each of us born into the world unable to indulge in learning all of the history of the world and learning a language and learning all the products of human thought. Imagine each of us starting over from square one. We would all be, crawling in the dirt, scratching up for food, because all of the knowledge of the world would be unavailable to us if it were censored. The free communication of thought, the freedom of us to choose what to read, what to learn, how to accord our own affairs, is ultimately our freedom to express our most distinctive faculty, which is our rational faculty. A mind has to be free to grasp knowledge, to be able to consider the possibilities and accept or reject them on its own terms. Because of that, we need political society that facilitates that. And to facilitate that means protecting that freedom of communicating the products of that mind. So Madison, James Madison, the author of the Bill of Rights, the father of the Constitution, crucially recognized that this is in fact the core faculty, that you must leave minds free. And so when he drafted the Memorial and Remonstrance in Virginia on religious freedom, he noted that you have to leave minds free to consider, accept, or reject ideas, because ultimately you can't have minds under force. All you have is bodies doing what you tell them to. You don't have humans anymore. So in effect, the proper justification for free speech is a recognition of humanity's distinct means of survival, which translates into humanity's moral impetus, which is to think for yourself and to apply yourself to the world. And in a social system, that means protecting the rights to do that. So that ultimately, I submit, is the broadest justification that allows us to say stupid things and meaningless things, but it leaves us free to be the judge of that, provided that we do so within the capacity of protecting the freedom of others, not using that to harm others in actual physical ways. So that, and again, it's the freedom, if we think about it today, it's the freedom to criticize what's going on around the world. It's the freedom to speak out and to advocate and to call on people to act, to support the right causes, to condemn the wrong people. That's what the freedom of speech is all about. Even if it's political, or whether it's just the freedom to advocate that in a small community about a religious difference you might have, or a social or cultural difference. It's the freedom of a band to promote an album. It's everything. It's all the products of our minds that are just as important as, advocating for a candidate. It's just as important to be able to sing the song I want and to choose the poem I want and any of those things. It's the whole thing. I get really worked up about this. So, but yeah, that's ultimately really what it's about. So let me I do want to reserve a little bit of time for questions. So
perfect. Yeah, that's good. That now that you're worked out about it.
Yeah. I'm ready to jump on the barricades.
Perfect. So we have a very quick and easy question for you.
Sure.
What do you think about the indictment of Julian Assange?
Yeah. So, this is interesting. So Assange and Snowden and others, this is a difficult question, because in spirit and often I think in the case of what they are trying to expose, I support them. I do think, though, that in the instances where they have violated contractual agreements, or where they have accepted effectively what is stolen property, it makes it such that there are cases where individuals who believe in a cause, sometimes have to pay the price for that cause. If we look back to the history of civil disobedience in free societies, but yeah, the exposure of government spying and corruption, and I think I personally have a much more sympathetic place in my heart for individuals who are willing to violate the law, which are if you say, look, there's a legitimate law that says that you can't disclose state secrets if you have privileged information as a part of your employment. And that's a reasonable thing. It's a thing a government should have the ability to do. But if an individual that is privy to that information is aware that these are rights violating instances of government action, morally, I don't condemn that. Morally, I think that is someone who has tremendous courage. But I also believe in the rule of law, and I believe that the means of fixing it is sunlight is the best disinfectant. But the individuals who sometimes reveal that are going to be subject to criminal penalty. So I guess I'm a little bit mixed. Spiritually, I think it's ending government corruption and spying and things like that are good things.
Yeah, fair enough. It's very complicated, but it was an easy question for me to ask.
Yeah.
Another question we have is that we talked about censorship, and then you said censorship comes from government. That's when we call it censorship. The user known as Tim asked, "What about when Biden administration pressures?" My internet going off.
Oh, there we are. Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I'll continue reading the question. So the user known as Tim asks, "What about when the Biden administration pressures social media platforms to silence views that the government does not like? Can we also consider this censorship?"
Yeah, it's very close to it. It's very close to it. It's. I mean, the operative question, I think, in that situation where public officials are putting on pressure to private businesses to remove or censor or not platform certain speech, the operative question is what happens when they say no. In this case, they don't, right? I mean, in this case, these the people in the C-suites and the people who operate these companies have often been in agreement with the political side. But just because these companies have political agreement with the government doesn't mean that they're censoring. What the operative question is, what would happen if one of these companies said no? We don't currently have the answer, and there's a very tricky distinction, because if for example, Congress, which has on both the Democratic and the Republican sides been arguing to remove Section 230 for the listeners who know about the protection for freedom of speech on the internet, for various reasons, they've been arguing that companies like Google and Facebook and Apple and others should come under different rules. But the rule has actually been made for everyone from the lowliest little blog who has 12 comments to the largest social media company. The administration may say a lot of things, and they may call on people, and they may even promote certain ideas and say, this is what should be part of the public discussion. But it's only when actual penalties are handed down. Now, the threat is always there. They have a massive regulatory state that could easily clamp down on these companies. And it's almost like the sword of Damocles that they're sitting under, thinking, wow, I have so many areas of permission that I have to ask and navigate around in order to make sure that the government doesn't shut down my business or break up my business or whatever. Maybe I'll just go along to get along. I don't know that it's a clear instance in censorship yet. What would be interesting is if there were a principled individual who actually stood up and said no, and made it a really loud test case to say, I don't care what you think about misinformation. My platform is my platform. I'm going to do what I want with it. And then if suddenly they found themselves subject of an antitrust regulation, et cetera, then we would know that this was censorship by proxy. I don't know that we know that yet, but they're getting really close to it, and it's a scary thing, that kind of pressure that they can bring.
Yeah, and we actually made a video about Section 230 a couple of months ago. I remember the whole debate about it. And I think it's very interesting because both from left and right, you see these people trying to censor free speech by using different, of course, tools, but at the end, the aim is the same. And I think we have a question that you would enjoy that's very much on the same line.
Okay.
Zayoba asks, should social media be a public utility or remain privatized? Free speech is threatened when it is controlled by a corporation that is not accountable to the public.
Well, I mean, this is interesting. In some ways, the argument that social media companies or big tech is not accountable to the public is, I mean, to me, on its face, the public has the choice about what social media they use. I know that 200 million people have a network effect, and boy, people really like to see what grandma posts on Facebook. But you can make a choice about whether the policies are something that you accept or not. You can make a choice about, and I know that there's a long argument and a lot of detail to be had about whether it's an effective thing to say, if you don't like this, then start your own company, because that's incredibly hard. But it's not unprecedented, right? I mean, Facebook was not always the dominant player, and it may not always be the dominant player given recent developments. For those of us old enough to remember MySpace and Friendster and Orkut and various other social media companies that came and went, some of those, MySpace was seen as dominant, and then Facebook came along and it innovated in a way that people desired. But now its policies may be such that it's innovating in a way against what people want. those corporations are always subject to the dollars that they can earn. And those dollars that they earn are always voluntary contributions. If 200 million Americans canceled Facebook tomorrow, I mean, their ad revenue and other things because of Apple's policies have already fallen 20-something%. That would cripple the company. And it may well lead to the demise of the company, and people could sign up for new forms of social media. What's crucial is that even though they're very large, and even though they may be, so to speak, unresponsive to the public, what's certain is that declaring them a public utility would be going backwards, in my view, in terms of the freedom. Public utilities are a corruption of an idea about that arose in the progressive era as a way of putting certain companies under public control, a quasi-socialist type policy, on the assumption that if you were in a certain business, you had a enforceable obligation to do business whether you wanted to or not. So, for example, all of the programmers, all of the stockholders, all of the people who control Facebook and who have made Facebook, if they were to be declared a public utility, would be told, you have no choice but to accept all of these people as customers. You have no choice but to do business in the way that we dictate. You now have the choice of either going out of business or doing it the way that we tell you, by government fiat. Well, that's no way to run a business. That's not a private business. The rights to property of all of those stockholders and shareholders and the employees would be liquidated by declaring them a public utility, because it would put them under control of, I mean, I think it would be a worse idea. It's bad enough if we think that the people running Facebook disagree with liberty. It's even worse if you put it under government control that's subject to the vagaries of the political process. And Nazlı, I just wanted to, a thing that occurred to me about your last point as I was speaking, the arguments about free speech today, about 230 and the way that it comes from both sides, it strikes me as really, really dangerous. It's often commented in today's argument that, you know, the so-called defenders of free speech on the left, who the ACLU and others who were so promotive of freedom, are now the ones that are censoring and telling people that they shouldn't be allowed to speak. But even the ones on the right who said, like, oh, you know, you shouldn't be so sensitive, let people speak, let disagreeable ideas come out. Both of those sides now are embracing a kind of defense of power versus freedom. So I was just reading a recent book on freedom of speech by a young conservative, Michael Knowles. Speechless is the title of his book. And I was astounded to find, and I've been on his show, so I hope I'm not stepping on his toes, but I was astounded to see that he endorsed an idea that Stanley Fish, a former professor at Duke, had, which was, the title of Stanley Fish's book was "There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and It's a Good Thing Too." I mean, he basically said that no one really believes in the freedom of speech. That he in the book, he, I think, says free speech and censorship is an illusory distinction, that every society censors, and it's only about who has power to censor. Now, I submit that if that's where the debate has gone, where both left and right are saying, and that's what they're saying with 230, is that we don't really want people to be free. We just want our group to be in control. And that means that if we made public utilities out of social media companies, out of big corporations, then that control is only going to be wrested into political hands. And it's going to be my tribe versus your tribe. And unfortunately, our tribe, the tribe of liberty, is going to lose out, because neither of those sides fully embraces the idea of freedom and of human flourishing unconstrained by government controls. So it's super important that we not sort of sign on to people who are sympathetic but not true friends of the liberty movement, because it can be very dangerous that they're really only just seeking power.
Yeah, that would be a very bleak future for us if you don't believe that freedom of speech actually doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So I have the last question.
Okay.
It's sort of like a thought experiment. So Benjamin Barber says that if your phone or internet service provider decides that it doesn't like your speech and decides to disconnect your internet on phone, is it censorship? And I like to make it a bit harder, the question. So let's say that they provide you internet, but if you allow them to, like, if you don't allow them to go through your messages or something, it makes it very expensive. So you actually do have access to internet in some way, but not exactly. And they can say that we can go through your stuff, and if you don't like it, we're not going to post it or something like that.
Yeah. This is, I mean, so this raises what I think is probably one of the most difficult issues about the modern mixed economy. And that is, in a very substantial way, are what we consider to be private businesses, our telecom providers, our cellular providers, et cetera, many of which are public utilities, according to the government, are not in fact private businesses. They're not acting fully freely on the judgment of their corporate shareholders. They're doing so under a deeply and highly regulated process that allocates the spectrum, for example, that dictates who can have cellular infrastructure in the country, that dictates who's allowed to get onto the backbone of the internet, et cetera. And for those companies, for those decisions to be made based upon the speaking of individuals is very fraught with, as I said, it's kind of proxy censorship in a way, because those companies may be acting in a way to please the regulators and ultimately the political class, to ensure that they can kind of fly under the radar, without saying, if you platform certain speech or if you allow certain speech, we're going to punish you. And so they'll take proactive or preventative action. That's a very dangerous thing. I think, though, that in the spirit of saying the way to solve these problems is by increasing our liberties, the way to solve these problems is not just to advocate for more robust free speech and a culture of free speech, but it's also to advocate for economic freedom, right? I mean, this is one of the cardinal truths of the liberty movement, is that a free mind and free markets are absolutely integrated, right? I mean, that's Reason Magazine's slogan, that you cannot support freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, without also supporting freedom of contract, freedom of property. These are an integrated whole. Individual rights cannot be parted out and protected in isolation. They have to be a robust, unified whole. And that's why we need this kind of broad philosophic argument for rights that I think is missing from today's debate. Because otherwise, then, we're trying to say that we hold corporations accountable because they're too wrapped up with the government, et cetera. The way to solve that is not to pass a law that says that they're not allowed to do that. The way to solve that ultimately is to remove the backs of to remove the government regulators from their backs, to give them the freedom so that they are truly a competitive business. And if they make bad decisions by censoring their users or requiring their users to disclose the speech that they engage in, that those users can move to another company that doesn't do that there's actual competition in the marketplace, which doesn't exist now. So I think, though complicated and though certainly very tricky, my core argument would always be the solution to these problems is to advocate in the direction of liberty in all accounts, because those are the ways that human beings actually can sort through these problems and have a free society, rather than making it the back and forth kind of pendulum of a society that just goes from good laws to bad laws.
Exactly. That's perfect. I think this is a great point to end our discussion. And
Sure.
This was great. We have more questions, but if you want to ask them more, you can go to Eric Daniels, probably his website or his social media accounts. I think he'd be very happy to answer more of your questions. And also don't want to take too much of your time.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, it's been a great time. I've really enjoyed it.
Yes, it was really good. Eric Daniels is Assistant Director of Clemson Institute. My name is Nazlıcan. I'm the Research Director at SFL. Thank you very much, everyone who joined us today. Hope to see you again in this channel very soon. Bye.